Ethan Miller was 10 years old, and he believed, with the uncompromising faith of a child obsessed, that Halloween was the final, perfect holiday. It wasn't about the commercial gloss of Christmas or the obligatory cheer of Thanksgiving. It was a festival of glorious, self-aware darkness, a temporary truce with the mundane. In Blackwood Creek, Massachusetts, this belief felt particularly potent. Blackwood Creek wasn't just a suburb. It was a settlement clinging stubbornly to its colonial roots, where the air in late October always smelled of wet pine needles, burning wood smoke, and something faintly metallic, like old, damp earth. The town's history, whispered over crackling bonfires, involved more than just pilgrims. It involved hangings, cold-hearted accusations, and ground that, many locals claimed, was cursed. This year, Ethan's obsession had reached its zenith. His father, Robert Miller, an otherwise reserved accountant, indulged this passion with a fervor that seemed slightly unnatural. While other dads bought cheap plastic bags of filler cotton, Robert bought industrial-grade fog machines, elaborate, anatomically correct resin skeletons, and enough fake cobweb spray to mummify their entire two-story colonial house. More atmosphere, fewer ghosts. Robert would often say, his eyes distant, almost protective. He valued immersion, not jump scares. It was 4 days before October 31st. The Miller front yard was transforming into a set piece for a Gothic horror film. The centerpiece was the enormous, sprawling oak of the Skirse, a 100-year-old tree whose lowest limbs drooped over the sidewalk like arthritic claws. Hanging from its thickest branch was a 6-foot-tall figure they called the Ragman. A scarecrow made of burlap, stuffed with straw, and given terrifyingly blank, stitched eyes. "Dad, the fog machine needs to point through the gate, not just at the porch," Ethan instructed, his hands smeared with synthetic cobweb residue, his ninja costume already half-planned in his head. Robert was on his knees, meticulously weaving orange LED lights around the base of the oak. He was a tall man, usually calm, but Ethan noticed a constant, almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders this autumn. He checked the locks on the doors 3 times, even when the sun was high. "I know, we need to create a tunnel effect. But first, the foundation. If the lighting is wrong, the atmosphere fails." Robert looked up, his gaze sweeping the quiet street before settling back on his work. Ethan was not alone in this creative endeavor. His 2 best friends were there to help, pulled in by the promise of the Miller house being the undisputed spookiest stop in Blackwood Creek. There was Lucas, 14, with the aloof confidence only 9th grade can bestow. Lucas was invaluable because he could reach the high branches of the oak without a ladder and could run electrical cords with the speed and precision of a professional. "The Ragman looks too happy, Ethan," Lucas commented, pulling a loop of heavy fishing line tight around the scarecrow's neck to give it a more strangled posture. "Needs to look like he's in pain." And then there was Chloe, 12, pragmatic and slightly cynical, who handled all the small, tedious details. She was currently dusting a trio of plastic skulls with a fine layer of gray flour to give them an authentic, grave dirt patina. "He's going to be the envy of the whole street, Ethan. Just watch Mrs. Henderson's house fail with her single string of pumpkin lights." They worked in a comfortable, almost silent rhythm. The front yard was a hive of controlled chaos. The whisper of spray glue, the soft clink of Robert setting up a timer for the fog machine, and the gentle, rhythmic scrape of Lucas tightening a cable tie. "Okay, Chloe, you finish the porch railing, I'm getting the final touches on the ragman, Ethan said, grabbing a bottle of theatrical blood designed to dry dark and crusty. He was standing on a weathered stone bench, carefully dabbing the blood onto the scarecrow's stitched mouth, when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise or a change in the light. It was a silence, deeper than the autumn quiet. Ethan glanced up. The street was empty except for him. The man was standing across the street, leaning against a lamp post that was still unlit in the fading afternoon sun. He wasn't walking a dog, he wasn't jogging, and he didn't have a phone. He was simply there. He was utterly, disturbingly average, maybe late 30s or early 40s, wearing plain, dark gray slacks and a zip-up leather jacket that looked cheap and utilitarian. His hair was cropped short, his features nondescript. He blended into the shadows of the old neighborhood so well that he might have been a part of the backdrop, a trick of the light. But there was his face. He wasn't smiling in a friendly way. His mouth was stretched wide, forming a grin that was too hard, too high, and too still. It didn't involve his eyes, which were a washed-out color that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They were fixed not on the decorations but specifically on Ethan. Ethan froze, the bottle of fake blood trembling in his hand. He was an outgoing kid, but this smile, this absolute stillness, felt wrong. Felt less like admiration and more like assessment. The man pushed off the lamppost, the movement slow, almost liquid, and began to cross the street toward the Miller property. He walked directly toward the oak of the skirse, his gaze never leaving Ethan. "Wow," the man said, his voice a surprising, soft baritone, like sandpaper rubbed over cedar. "You kids are really putting on a show. The best I've seen this season." Ethan, despite the prickle of fear, managed a small, forced smile back. "Thanks. We're trying to be the scariest house on the block." "The scariest?" the man repeated, tilting his head slightly. His eyes briefly flicked down to the ragman. The scarecrow Ethan had just been dressing with blood. "He certainly looks like he's met a very unhappy end." He took another step, now standing just on the edge of the lawn. The proximity made Ethan's skin crawl. The man was taller than he'd initially appeared, and his hands, visible beneath the sleeves of his jacket, were encased in tight, black leather gloves. "Tell me, kid," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, making it sound conspiratorial. "You're all planning on going out, aren't you? Trick or treating?" "Yeah, of course." "Excellent, excellent. You need a good route for a haul like that." He gestured vaguely at the decorations with a gloved hand. "A route that takes you off the main street. Tell me, which parts of Blackwood Creek are you thinking? The old paths down by the river? Or the ones that run behind the Hendersons?" The questions felt too specific. They were intrusive, demanding a disclosure of vulnerable information. It was then that Ethan felt a firm, heavy weight land on his shoulder. Robert Miller had appeared instantly, silently, from around the side of the porch, putting himself physically between Ethan and the man. Ethan could feel his father's hand tighten, just a fraction. It was a signal, "Be quiet. Stay put." Robert's voice was calm, almost dangerously so, lacking any of the forced cheer often used to diffuse awkward interactions. "Can I help you, sir? We're finishing up our private decorations." The man's hard smile flickered, a momentary tremor of something hostile passing across his lips. But it reformed quickly. He stared past Robert at the ragman. "Just admiring the dedication," the watcher said, his voice retaining that unsettling softness. He looked over Robert's shoulder, right into Ethan's eyes, and held the gaze. "Make sure you choose the darkest roads, son. I'll be watching for you. I've got things planned for the ones who stray from the light." Robert's grip on Ethan's shoulder became iron. "It's time to go inside, Ethan. Now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled off the bench and walked toward the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't stop himself from glancing back. Robert was still standing, absolutely motionless, facing the man. And the man was no longer smiling. The mask of benign curiosity had dropped, revealing a face of cold, pure, unsettling fixation. He stared at Robert with something akin to silent, furious resentment, before turning abruptly. He walked away, not down the street, but diagonally across the lawn, toward the edge of the creek, and disappeared into the gathering fog. The encounter with the man, the watcher, as Ethan instantly named him in the private theater of his mind, left a residue of cold anxiety in the Miller house. Robert Miller, usually the picture of stoic composure, was visibly agitated. After Ethan retreated inside, he locked the front door, not with a simple click, but with the measured, forceful thunk of the deadbolt, followed by the slide of the security chain. "He's gone, Dad," Ethan said, watching his father's movements from the living room archway. Robert didn't immediately reply. He stood by the window for a full 2 minutes, looking out across the lawn and toward the dense line of trees that marked the edge of Blackwood Creek. The twilight fog had thickened, turning the familiar street into a blurry, indistinct canvas. "I didn't like that, Ethan," Robert finally said, turning to face his son. His eyes were focused, sharp. His questions were inappropriate. They were fishing. "He just wanted to know our trick-or-treating route," Ethan mumbled, trying to minimize the strangeness, though his own heart insisted the man's intent had been far darker. He didn't want candy. He wanted information. And that smile, it was manufactured, like a porcelain mask that could crack at any moment and reveal what was underneath. Robert came over and crouched down, placing his hands on Ethan's shoulders, his touch reassuringly solid. "Listen to me. If you see him again, anywhere, anytime, you do not talk to him. You run to the nearest adult, and you tell me immediately." "Understood." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the instruction. This wasn't a standard parental warning. It was a primal directive. The incident cast a pall over the remaining days. Lucas and Chloe, sensing the underlying disturbance, finished their decorating with less enthusiasm. Lucas, the pragmatic teenager, tried to rationalize it. He was probably just a weird old guy from the next town over, trying to find out where the rich houses are. But Chloe was more perceptive. "He only looked at you, Ethan, and your dad." It was like he was testing the water. The atmosphere in the house grew tight. Robert started getting home from his accounting firm earlier than usual, sometimes just after the sun began to dip below the horizon. He also installed a new, floodlit security camera that rotated slowly, casting a cold, silver-white glow over the oak of the Skirse and the ragmen. 3 nights before Halloween, Ethan couldn't sleep. The tension was too thick, the silence of the night in Blackwood Creek too loud. He was trying to read by the dim light of his bedside lamp when, around 1 a.m., he heard it. It wasn't a sudden crash or a loud bang. It was a sound that seemed to scrape against the silence. A single, dull clack, followed by a faint, metallic whisper, like something heavy being dragged slowly across concrete. Ethan's bedroom was on the second floor, positioned perfectly to overlook the front yard. Curiosity, that relentless thief of common sense, pulled him from his bed. He crept to the window, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and peered through the narrow slit between the blinds. The floodlight was on, bathing the yard in an unnatural, stark white. The thick fog from the nearby creek had rolled in, hanging low and making the light appear milky and diffuse. And there he was, the watcher. He was standing slightly off-center, partially obscured by the dense trunk of the oak of the skirse, making him a figure of shadow and contrast. The sound Ethan had heard must have been him scuffing his boots on the sidewalk, or perhaps the unintentional clack of a tool. He wasn't moving. He was simply staring at the house, specifically at the line of second-floor windows, as if calculating angles or judging depth. Ethan held his breath, every nerve ending screaming. He felt, with absolute certainty, that the man was looking directly into his room, even though the blinds were mostly closed. It was a physical invasion, a gaze that seemed to penetrate wood and glass. Then the watcher moved, not toward the house but toward the central figure of the decorations, the ragman. With a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly terrifying, he reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and withdrew an object that glinted briefly in the floodlight, a thin, razor-sharp utility blade. He held it carefully, the black leather of his glove contrasting starkly with the polished metal. The man walked right up to the scarecrow. The ragman, strung up and grimacing, seemed to watch him helplessly. The watcher raised the knife, not with the quick, panicked motion of a vandal, but with the surgical precision of a man performing a planned execution. He plunged the blade deep into the scarecrow's burlap belly and pulled downwards, releasing a cascade of dry, brittle straw onto the grass. He repeated the motion, carving a large, ragged, inverted V into the figure's torso. Then, with an almost tender gesture, he reached out, grasped the ragman's stitched-up head, and slowly, deliberately sawed through the fishing line that held its neck. The burlap head dropped with a soft, sickening thud into the straw pile beneath the oak. The watcher paused, looking at his work. His face was still, emotionless, a blank slate that only amplified the coldness of his action. He was desecrating a piece of harmless art, yet the violence of the act felt deeply personal. As he turned to leave, his movement was again slow and deliberate. But as the floodlight caught his hands, Ethan's blood ran cold. Around the man's right wrist, visible for only a fleeting second above the edge of his black leather glove, was a faint, dull shimmer. It was a small piece of metal, maybe an inch or two long, hanging loosely. It looked exactly like a fragment of old, heavily rusted chain. It was so tiny, so insignificant, yet its presence was a sickening confirmation that this man was not merely eccentric. The watcher walked toward the shadowy edge of the yard, disappearing behind the thick curtain of the fog. Ethan stayed frozen, staring at the sight of the headless ragman, its body carved open, lying broken under the oak. He finally snapped out of his trance and ran, not to his father's room, but straight down the stairs. "Dad! Dad!" he cried, arriving breathless in the dimly lit kitchen. He was here. The man. He cut Ragman's head off. Robert Miller appeared instantly, grabbing the baseball bat he had started keeping by the back door. He moved with a speed Ethan hadn't known he possessed, throwing open the front door and charging into the cold, damp air. Ethan watched from the doorway as his father swept the yard with the beam of his heavy flashlight. The beam illuminated the evidence. The ragged pile of straw, the shredded burlap torso, and the detached head lying face down in the wet grass. Robert searched the entire yard, circling the oak of the skirse twice, his face etched with silent fury. He scanned the creek edge, the neighbor's property line, and the street. After what felt like an hour, he came back inside. He relocked the door, his movements measured and heavy, and leaned the bat against the wall. "I saw him, Dad. I swear. He had a knife." "He cut the head off," Ethan insisted, his voice trembling on the verge of tears. Robert sighed, running a hand over his face. "I believe you, E. I believe you saw something. But there's no one here now. And if he's doing this kind of thing—" Robert glanced down at the bat. "It means he's trying to scare us off. He wants us to be worried." He picked up the headless figure the next morning and quietly threw it into the trash, replacing it with a simple, unadorned plastic ghost. The oak of the skirse stood bare. The unspoken message was clear. The Watcher had won the first round. He had marked their territory. The day after the ragman's execution, the atmosphere inside the Miller home was thick enough to cut with a knife. The house, usually a sanctuary of warmth, now felt like a fortified prison. Robert Miller was not sleeping. Ethan would hear the floorboards creaking late at night, a testament to his father's restless patrol. Robert made a series of changes that Ethan's mother, who was away on an emergency work trip until November 1st, would have undoubtedly questioned. He installed motion sensors along the perimeter of the backyard, armed the security system twice daily, and started carrying a small, heavy wrench in the pocket of his jeans at all times. But the most significant change was the secret project Robert undertook in the garage. "Come here, E," Robert said on the morning of October 30th, his voice low and serious. He led Ethan to the workbench. On the bench lay a miniature, meticulously crafted doll. It wasn't a toy. It was crude, made from 2 pieces of scavenged wood crossed into a crucifix, wrapped tightly in masking tape, and clothed in a swatch of old, gray fabric. It was less than 6 inches tall. "What is it, Dad? A tiny scarecrow?" Ethan asked, trying to sound normal. "This is an insurance policy," Robert muttered, his eyes distant as he handled the figure. "It's a dummy, a simple decoy." He took a small, silver tracking device, the kind used for tracking lost keys, barely the size of a coin, and taped it securely to the center of the figure's chest. He then pulled a heavy, woolen jacket out of a storage bin. It was Ethan's favorite ninja costume jacket, the one he planned to wear tomorrow night. Robert carefully sewed the small wooden figure, the decoy, into the inner lining of the jacket, just below the shoulder blade. The seam was neat, nearly invisible. "Ethan, listen carefully. This tracker is linked directly to my phone. If you leave the neighborhood perimeter, it alerts me. If you're in danger, it gives me your exact coordinates. But you cannot, under any circumstances, tell Lucas or Chloe about this. This is our secret." Ethan felt a surge of fear mixed with a strange, solemn pride at being entrusted with such a critical secret. "Why are we doing this, Dad? Why won't the police help?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his already messy hair. Because the police won't take action until there's a crime beyond vandalism. And I don't want to wait until then. That man, the Watcher, he's not a random vandal, Ethan. He was assessing us. He's looking for a target that deviates from the norm. And he knows we're worried. He wants us to be worried. The tension intensified on October 31st, Halloween Day. Lucas and Chloe arrived immediately after school, bristling with nervous energy. The recent events hadn't dampened their enthusiasm for candy, but they had amplified their caution. Okay, so new rules, Lucas announced, strapping a fake werewolf paw to his wrist. We stick together. No going down any street that doesn't have at least 4 porch lights on. And we don't talk to anyone who isn't obviously a parent or a teenager. Ethan, zipping up his newly modified ninja jacket, felt the uncomfortable stiffness of the wooden figure pressing against his back. He was no longer just dressing up as a ninja. He was dressing up as a marked target. The hours dragged by slowly. They ate pizza in silence, occasionally glancing out the window at the deepening gloom. The fog, a persistent character in Blackwood Creek, was rolling in early, thicker than ever. It was the kind of fog that didn't just obscure sight. It seemed to absorb sound. Robert, dressed in casual clothes, sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a newspaper but constantly checking his phone, which lay face up beside his coffee mug. At 6:30 p.m., the accepted hour of departure, Ethan gathered his oversized canvas candy bag. Stay safe, boys. Chloe, Robert said, standing up. He came over to Ethan and adjusted the collar of his ninja jacket, his fingers briefly pressing against the wooden form hidden in the lining. It was a silent, anxious acknowledgement of the danger they were sending him into. We're staying in the usual blocks, Mr. Miller, Lucas promised, pulling his werewolf mask over his head. No, you're not, Robert corrected, his voice firm. You stick to Main Street only. And you are back here by 8:30 p.m. sharp. If you are not, I'm coming out to find you. They agreed, though they exchanged slightly disappointed looks. Main Street had all the boring, fun-sized candy. As they headed out, Robert watched from the doorway, the bright kitchen light spilling out behind him, his shadow stretching long and thin across the porch. The first hour was a success. The familiar streets were alive with costumed kids and the good-natured cacophony of the holiday. Ethan, Lucas, and Chloe quickly filled their bags with the acceptable standard of candy. They felt a momentary relief. Maybe the Watcher had been scared off by the new security measures, or maybe he was simply a strange man who had moved on to terrorize another family. But then Lucas, emboldened by a handful of full-sized chocolate bars, gestured down a side street. Okay, fine, Main Street is boring, but Mr. Caldwell's house is down Elm Alley. They give out gift cards. It's only 3 houses down and it loops right back to Main. Elm Alley. It was narrow, shaded even during the day, and lined with ancient, overgrown hedges. Tonight, it was a tunnel of absolute blackness, the fog clinging to the cobblestones like a shroud. No, Lucas, Ethan instantly objected, the memory of his father's warning sharp in his mind. Stay on Main Street. Come on, E. It's safe. Look, I see the lights from the Caldwell's porch, way down there. Lucas pointed. Chloe, usually the voice of reason, was swayed by the promise of gift cards. We can sprint it. 2 minutes, in and out. Ethan hesitated, his hand reaching back instinctively to touch the small, hard lump of the wooden figure sewn into his jacket. If you leave the neighborhood perimeter, it alerts me. Elm Alley wasn't technically outside the neighborhood, but it felt like a deviation. Felt like straying. Fine, Ethan conceded against his better judgment. But we stick to the edge of the light. No detours. They left the comforting glow of Main Street and plunged into Elm Alley. The sudden silence was unnerving. The fog dampened all ambient noise, the distant shouts of other children, the music from block parties, leaving only the soft shush-shush of their capes and costumes against the damp air. They were barely 30 feet into the darkness, walking briskly toward the distant porch light, when a voice, strangely close and too familiar, cut through the quiet. "Hey kids! Lost your way!" They froze. The voice had come from their left, from the deep shadows behind a towering, century-old rhododendron bush. The voice was that soft, raspy baritone Ethan hadn't forgotten. And then he stepped out. The Watcher. The Watcher stepped fully into the hazy, sulphurous light cast by the distant Caldwell's porch. He stood less than 10 feet away, and the sight of him was worse than any shadow. His appearance hadn't changed, the same dark slacks and utilitarian leather jacket. But tonight, the atmosphere around him was different. It was charged with raw, predatory intent. He was not holding a bowl or offering candy. In his right, gloved hand, he gripped something heavy, dark, and earth-stained. It was a chipped, ancient garden shovel, the kind with a short, wide blade and a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. The wood of the handle, where it met his black glove, was slick with dampness and what looked suspiciously like reddish-brown mud. But it was his face that truly paralyzed them. The hard, porcelain smile Ethan remembered was gone. It had been replaced by an expression of pure, chilling fixation. His pale eyes seemed to be burning holes into Ethan's ninja costume, completely ignoring Lucas's snarling werewolf mask and Chloe's frantic vampire cape. "You strayed from the light, Ethan," the Watcher murmured, his voice now devoid of its initial sweetness, a dry, raspy whisper that barely carried in the thick fog. "Didn't listen to your father, did you? That's what bad boys do. And bad boys get lost on the dark paths." Lucas, despite his older age, was the first to realize the true gravity of the situation. This was no prank. This was not an eccentric neighbor. The shovel, the intense gaze, the isolation of Elm Alley. It all clicked into a terrifying clarity. "Stay back," Lucas yelled, pushing Ethan and Chloe slightly behind him, adopting a defensive posture that was more bravery than common sense. "We're leaving. Leave us alone." The Watcher chuckled, a dry, coughing sound. "You think you're protecting him, big boy? He's the reason we're here. He's the reason you all came down this road." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the shovel dragging slightly on the cobblestones. Ktsch. The sound of metal scraping stone, amplified by the heavy silence of the fog, was a visceral, horrifying noise. It was the sound of preparation. "Come here, Ethan. Let's finish what we started in your garden. I told you I knew how to make the ragmen look better. Didn't I?" The man's focus was absolute. His eyes locked on the area just behind Ethan's shoulder, the exact spot where the small, wooden decoy figure was sewn. Ethan didn't need Lucas's permission this time. Fear, cold and sharp, seized his lungs. He spun around. "Run!" he screamed, already sprinting back the way they came. his heavy candy bag bouncing painfully against his legs. Lucas and Chloe followed instantly. They were running blind, spurred only by panic. The heavy fog made visibility nearly impossible, turning every shadow into a potential stumbling block. Behind them, the Watcher wasn't running wildly. He was pacing them with an unnervingly fast, smooth gait. The most terrifying thing was the sound. Ethan could hear the rhythmic, heavy thud KTSA of the man's boots hitting the cobblestones, punctuated by the terrible, grating scrape of the shovel being dragged along, occasionally catching an uneven flagstone. "Ethan, wait for me," Chloe cried, her breath already ragged. The alley, which had seemed so short before, stretched out endlessly. Lucas, lighter and faster, was pulling ahead, disappearing into the wall of fog toward the perceived safety of Main Street. Chloe, slowed by fear and fatigue, started to lag. Ethan risked a glance back. The Watcher was closer than he should have been. The glow from the streetlights painted his figure in a sickly, elongated silhouette. His face was a mask of furious concentration. He hadn't broken his stride, and he wasn't even looking at Chloe, who was struggling desperately just yards behind him. His entire focus, his entire momentum, was directed solely at Ethan. The realization was like a physical blow. He doesn't want them. He only wants me. Ethan forced his legs to pump harder, the thick ninja jacket feeling heavy, cumbersome, a trap. He could hear the Watcher breathing heavily now, a wet, ragged sound that was right behind his shoulder. Thud KTSCH. Thud KTSCH. He felt a sudden, sharp tug on his costume. The Watcher had reached out with his free, gloved hand and snagged the fabric of the ninja jacket right between his shoulder blades, precisely where the decoy figure was sewn. Ethan screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He felt the force of the pull trying to jerk him backward, off his feet, toward the darkness and the waiting shovel. This is it. It's over, Ethan thought, remembering the terrifying gash in the ragman's belly. Then, a sound that cut through the terror and the fog like a flash of lightning. Not the scrape of metal, but the furious, roaring growl of an engine, followed by the deafening squeal of tires. "Get away from my son." It wasn't a warning. It was a roar of pure, paternal rage. Mr. Robert Miller's dark sedan came skidding sideways from the mouth of the alley, the headlights cutting twin, blinding tunnels through the fog. The car stopped with a violent jerk, narrowly missing the hedge line. Robert had thrown the driver's door open and was charging toward them, illuminated momentarily by the glare of his own headlights. His face was pale, drawn, but twisted with a terrible, focused fury. In his hand, he wasn't holding a bat. He was holding the heavy, silver-gray wrench he had kept in his pocket. The Watcher's grip on Ethan's jacket vanished instantly. The sudden release of tension sent Ethan sprawling forward onto the cold, damp ground. For a brief, agonizing moment, the Watcher and Robert Miller stood face to face, separated by a mere 5 feet. The Watcher's expression, previously focused on Ethan, shifted to an intense, horrified shock at the sudden, unexpected intervention. He stared at Robert, then back at Ethan crumpled on the ground, and finally at the accelerating headlights bearing down on him. He made a split-second decision. Without a single word or another glance at the shovel now lying abandoned on the ground, the Watcher pivoted and sprinted into the surrounding fog, vanishing with unnatural speed into the dense shadows behind the alley's fences. Robert didn't pursue. He dropped the wrench and rushed to Ethan, pulling him up and crushing him into a suffocating embrace. A moment later, Lucas came scrambling back from the main street, his werewolf mask abandoned and tears streaming down his face. Chloe emerged from behind a massive trash bin, sobbing hysterically. They were safe, but the safety felt fragile and temporary. The silence in the alley, now broken by the shuddering sobs of the children, seemed heavier than before, burdened by the chilling scrape of the shovel and the sound of an interrupted capture. The black car that brought the Watcher was nowhere to be seen. Only the abandoned shovel, glinting dully in the light, remained as proof. The immediate aftermath was chaos woven into silence. Robert Miller held Ethan so tightly that the small wooden decoy pressed painfully into his son's back, a physical reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Lucas and Chloe were huddled together, their panicked sobs the only sound competing with the dull thumping of Robert's own heart. "He touched me, Dad. He grabbed me," Ethan choked out, his voice muffled against his father's dark jacket. Robert released him slowly, his eyes wild and scanning the surrounding shadows as if the Watcher might materialize at any second. He looked at the abandoned shovel, glinting innocently under the distant porch light, a tool of terror reduced to a piece of neglected hardware. "We need to get out of here, now," Robert commanded, his voice raw. He quickly ushered the three children back toward his sedan. As they passed the shovel, Robert paused, pulling a pair of disposable rubber gloves from the car's emergency kit. He approached the tool with the reverence one might show an unexploded ordnance. The shovel was ancient. Its wooden handle was deeply grooved, and the iron blade was coated in a thick, dark layer of fresh, heavy earth, wet and sticky despite the damp air. Robert didn't touch the blade, but his gaze focused on the very tip of the handle, near the scoop. There, embedded in the dried mud, was a cluster of fine, almost colorless strands of hair. He knew the police would scoff at a broken scarecrow and a scary man, but this was tangible proof of criminal intent. He took a single, rapid photograph with his phone, focusing on the mud and the hairs, before covering the shovel with a discarded plastic tarp he found under the car seat. He couldn't risk contaminating the scene, but he also couldn't leave the evidence unprotected in the fog. "Lucas, Chloe, you go straight to your homes. You tell your parents everything. You tell them what he looked like, what he said. Do not talk to anyone else." Robert's voice was firm, pulling them out of their hysteria. They ran, disappearing toward Main Street, their empty candy bags now dragging uselessly on the pavement. Ethan watched them go, a fissure opening between them. They had witnessed the same horror, but only Ethan knew the secret of the tracker and the true extent of his father's fear. Back at the Miller house, the kitchen light felt harsh and exposing. Robert immediately called the Blackwood Creek Police Department. The officer on the other end, a weary-sounding sergeant, listened with detached skepticism. "A man with a shovel, Mr. Miller? On Halloween?" The sergeant repeated flatly. "Did he steal anything? Did he assault anyone?" "He attempted to abduct my son at knife point 2 nights ago, and tonight he chased him with a shovel. He was using a tracking device on my property. He vandalized my personal effects. I have the abandoned shovel as evidence. It's covered in fresh dirt and hair," Robert argued, fighting to keep the tremor of rage out of his voice. "Sir, if you could just secure the item and we'll send a patrol car to file a report. We have dozens of calls tonight, mainly related to egging and noise violations." The police response was exactly what Robert had feared: a dismissal. 2 officers arrived nearly an hour later. They were polite but bored. They bagged the shovel without enthusiasm, cataloging the hair and mud with clinical indifference. Ethan, sitting on the sofa, watched his father interact with them. He saw the cold fury in Robert's eyes when one officer suggested that the shovel was likely a prop from a highly dedicated haunted house. Dedicated? Officer? He knew my son's name. He knew my son's location. He told him he was going to finish what we started in your garden, Robert stated, leaning in close to the officer. He was looking for a fresh grave, officer, not a fun house. The police took their report and left, promising to look into it. They advised Robert to keep his son indoors and be more mindful of where he let him wander on holiday nights. As the squad car pulled away, Robert sank onto the sofa beside Ethan. He was exhausted, the adrenaline crash leaving him pale and shaky. "They won't find him, will they?" Ethan whispered, clutching the arm of the sofa. "No, Robert admitted, pulling Ethan close. "They won't. They look for easy answers, not for the things hiding in the dark of Blackwood Creek." Robert reached up and gently unzipped Ethan's ninja jacket. He reached inside the lining, near the shoulder, and with a small, sharp tug, he ripped the stitching and extracted the small, wooden decoy figure. Ethan saw it clearly now. The crude cross, the masking tape, and the tiny silver tracker affixed to the chest. "He pulled on this spot, Dad?" Ethan said, touching the area between his shoulder blades. "He knew exactly where to grab me." Robert's eyes widened slightly. The stitching must have been visible, or... No, he was fixated on that area from the beginning. Robert's mind raced back to the words the Watcher had murmured. "He's the reason we're here. He told you he knew how to make the ragmen look better." The Watcher hadn't just been following them. He had seen the wooden figure sewn into the lining, perhaps during one of his earlier scouting missions. He hadn't been targeting Ethan the boy, but Ethan the symbolic figure, the scrawled figure that replaced the decapitated ragman. Robert removed the tracker and placed the small wooden figure on the coffee table. Its crudeness, its silent testimony, was overwhelming. The next few days brought no relief. The police called once to confirm that the fingerprints on the shovel belonged to a homeless man arrested years ago for public intoxication. A dead end. The hair analysis was inconclusive. The bond between Ethan, Lucas, and Chloe, forged in shared fear, began to fray. Lucas's father, a local lawyer, forbade Lucas from speaking about the incident, citing potential legal liability and a desire to maintain normalcy. Lucas became sullen and withdrawn, avoiding Ethan's eyes. Chloe, the most emotionally sensitive, suffered from violent night terrors. Her mother, deeply religious, convinced herself that the whole event was a satanic scare resulting from the children's fascination with pagan symbols like the pumpkin and the dark. She started avoiding the Miller family, viewing them as a source of bad influence. Ethan found himself completely isolated. He carried the full weight of the terror and his father's dark secret. The incident in Elm Alley had not only shown him a dangerous world outside the security of his home, but it had also revealed the fragility of trust and friendship, the truth that the Watcher had singled him out, that he was pursued not by a prankster but by something calculating and evil, was too heavy to share. On the third day, Ethan looked out at the oak of the Skirse. He felt a deep, chilling understanding of the fear his father held. Robert walked in holding a small, rolled-up, official-looking document. "The police have closed the case, E. They say there's no evidence of a crime beyond simple harassment." He didn't sound defeated, he sounded dangerous. "But what about the shovel, Dad? What about the mud?" Robert unrolled the document. It was a local municipal zoning map. He pointed to the end of Elm Alley. The shovel was covered in heavy clay and black silt. Blackwood Creek is primarily sandy loam. That kind of soil, that kind of soil only comes from one place. Robert tapped a finger on a small, undeveloped, wooded section of land just beyond the end of the alley. A dense, low-lying area that had been marked for years as a future housing development, but always remained untouched due to its unusually wet, dark, and challenging topography. "That's the forbidden path, E. And I think that's where we'll find his tracks." The following evening, November 4th, the Miller house was unnaturally quiet. The tension that had accumulated since Halloween coalesced into a silent, grim purpose. Robert had told Ethan that they were going on a scouting trip, a phrase that, despite its military undertones, felt desperately necessary. Robert was meticulous in his preparation. He brought out his old rucksack from the attic, the kind designed for wilderness hiking, not suburban sleuthing. He packed 2 heavy-duty flashlights, a coil of rope, a first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, and after a long internal debate that Ethan witnessed in strained silence, the heavy silver wrench, wrapped tightly in a thick towel. He also took the small GPS tracker, the one he had removed from the decoy, and slipped it into his own pocket. "We're not going to fight, E," Robert said, meeting Ethan's gaze, his voice low and steady, conveying a confidence he clearly didn't feel. "We are going to confirm a location. If we see anything at all, we leave immediately. Our goal is to get proof for the police, since they won't believe theory." Ethan, wearing thick boots and his warmest coat, not the ninja jacket, nodded. He felt a strange reversal of roles. His father, usually the rock, was navigating unknown terror, and Ethan, though terrified, felt grounded by the weight of the secret they shared. He was his father's witness. They drove to the outskirts of Elm Alley, parking the sedan 2 blocks away near a cluster of abandoned storage units. The fog was lighter tonight, replaced by a cold, cutting drizzle that made the pavement slick and the woods smell of wet decay. They walked the remaining distance in silence. The atmosphere was oppressive, the suburban quiet magnifying every rustle of the wet leaves. When they reached the end of Elm Alley, they found a rusted, chain-link fence marking the boundary of the undeveloped land. A faded, illegible sign warned against trespassing. "Here it is, the forbidden path," Robert whispered, shining his beam along the base of the fence. The light caught the ground, and Ethan gasped. The soil around the fence line was indeed the dry, sandy loam of Blackwood Creek. But directly beneath the fence, where a small, improvised gap had been created by bending the mesh, the earth was clearly churned up, a mass of dark, viscous clay and black silt, the exact type of mud found on the shovel. "He used this as an entry point," Robert confirmed, his jaw tight. "He walked right under the fence with the shovel. This is his path." They slipped through the opening. The moment they stepped onto the undeveloped land, the world changed. It was an instant descent from quiet suburbia into primal, untamed darkness. The land was marshy, low-lying, and dense with overgrown thickets and ancient, twisted scrub oaks. Robert led the way, his flashlight cutting a nervous, dancing beam through the woods. The ground was treacherous, squelching under their boots with every step. The thick clay clung to their soles, making each step a laborious effort. "Stay right behind me, Ethan. Step exactly where I step," Robert instructed. They moved slowly, fighting through thorny vines and across puddles that reflected the black sky. After about 20 minutes of difficult hiking, they heard it. The faint, metallic scent of petrol and the sight of a large, bulky silhouette hidden deep within a small, natural clearing. It was the Watcher's vehicle. The vehicle was an old, black, utilitarian work van, the kind used by contractors, completely unmarked and dull. It was backed up into the deepest part of the clearing, hidden masterfully behind two enormous, moss-covered boulders. The van's windows were tinted opaque black. Robert gripped Ethan's shoulder firmly. "We move silently now. We don't go closer than necessary." They crept around the clearing's perimeter, keeping low behind the dense vegetation. Robert used the flashlight sparingly, relying instead on the weak, ambient glow reflecting off the wet trees. As they circled, they noticed something unnerving about the clearing itself. It wasn't just untamed, it was disturbed. Large sections of the undergrowth were freshly trampled. The earth in the center of the clearing was particularly agitated, as if heavy machinery, or frequent heavy digging, had taken place there. Then Ethan spotted it. Just beyond the rear bumper of the black van, sticking out from a shallow pit, was an object that made his blood turn to ice. It was a pair of mud-caked, worn-out hiking boots, placed upright as if someone had just stepped out of them. They weren't discarded. They were placed deliberately. "Dad?" Ethan whimpered, pointing with a trembling hand. Robert saw them and swore under his breath. The boots confirmed this was not just a hiding spot. It was a temporary camp. Robert raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing one last time, slower this time, searching for something more conclusive. His beam caught the edge of a massive, rotted tree stump near the center. And on top of that stump, the Watcher had left a calling card. It was a small, crudely carved wooden face. The craftsmanship was basic, using a pocket knife. The features were simple. 2 deep eye sockets and a single, horizontally long, impossible grin carved from ear to ear. It was the same disturbing smile Ethan had first seen on the man's face, now rendered in lifeless, cold wood. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the face itself. Carved deeply into the back of the wooden piece, almost like a signature, was the number 12. 12. Ethan breathed, tears starting to sting his eyes. Robert didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, not at the wooden grimace, but at a spot just a few feet away from the tree stump. The ground there was a specific shallow depression, a freshly dug and then hastily refilled trench, about 6 feet long and unervingly narrow. The earth piled on top of it was the same sticky black silt. The implication hit them both simultaneously, a terrifying, silent scream. It was not just a hole. It was a grave, recently dug, and now refilled. Robert felt a crushing wave of utter, debilitating fear. Not the fear of a fight, but the existential dread of facing true evil. He had brought his son here, to the edge of a fresh grave, and the man who dug it had been one step ahead. He turned to run, to flee this place of death, when Ethan's small, cold hand reached out and grasped his wrist. "Wait, Dad. Look." Ethan's beam was focused on the ground next to the carved wooden face. It wasn't a track or a boot print. It was a single, tiny, frayed loop of iron. A section of the rusted, antique chain, identical to the one Robert had seen stuck in the fence, lay on the ground. It looked as if it had broken off a much larger segment. But what truly held Ethan's gaze was the number 12. He slowly looked back at the small, carved wooden figure on the stump, the figure with the grinning face. Then he looked at the wooden decoy figure that was currently lying on their kitchen table at home, the one Robert had sewn into his jacket. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking yet clear. "The decoy you made. It was just a little wooden cross, wrapped in masking tape. It looked like a doll, not a person." Robert frowned, confused by the sudden change of subject. "The one he cut in our yard was the ragman. But this one—" Ethan pointed to the crude, grinning wooden face on the stump. "This one is different. This one looks like a carving. And it has the number 12. Maybe he wasn't just watching me, Dad. Maybe he was keeping count." Robert stared at the wooden grin, and then at the nearby grave-shaped depression. The true, agonizing horror wasn't that the watcher had been there. The horror was that he had finished his work and left this chilling grin, this signature, specifically to let the Millers know they were too late. The final terrifying tableau, the grinning wooden face and the fresh, grave-shaped depression, shattered Robert Miller's remaining composure. He snatched the wooden carving off the stump, shoving it deep into his rucksack, and without another word, turned and pulled Ethan away. They didn't walk. They fled, stumbling back through the black silt and the thorny undergrowth. The journey that had taken 20 minutes in anxious stealth was covered in less than 10 minutes of panicked retreat. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the squelch pull of their boots freeing themselves from the heavy, sucking clay. They scrambled back under the chain-link fence and into the dubious safety of Elm Alley. Robert didn't stop to drive home. He drove directly to the Blackwood Creek police station. This time, Robert didn't call. He walked straight into the precinct lobby, pale, mud-caked, and clutching a backpack that contained a terrifying piece of evidence. The late-night desk sergeant, the same weary voice Robert had spoken to on Halloween, looked up in annoyance. "Mr. Miller, the harassment report is closed. You can't just—" "I found his camp, Sergeant," Robert interrupted, his voice low, steady, and dangerously calm. He dumped the rucksack onto the counter. The impact produced a dull thud. "I found the spot where he parked his van. I found the kind of clay soil that matches the shovel. And I found this." He pulled out the small, crude wooden face with the grotesque, wide grin. He placed it carefully on the counter, the number 12 carved into its back facing the sergeant. "We found a freshly dug and refilled trench right next to this. 6 feet long. Unnaturally narrow," Robert stated, his eyes boring into the officer. "He left this to tell us he finished his business. This man is a serial killer, and he is keeping count." The sergeant's blasé attitude finally cracked. The carving, combined with Robert's frantic but precise description of the vehicle and the disturbed earth, triggered a higher level of alert. Within the hour, the Blackwood Creek police had mobilized a tactical unit and forensic team to the coordinates Robert provided. Robert and Ethan sat in a small, windowless interview room, wrapped in foil blankets, watching the dawn struggle to break through the station's dirty windows. Ethan held the small, wooden decoy cross, the one his father had sewn into his jacket, as a kind of talisman. The hours stretched agonizingly long. Finally, the chief of police, a stern woman named Chief Reynolds, entered the room. Her expression was grave. "Mr. Miller, your information was critical. We located the vehicle, an old contractor's van, stolen over a year ago. It was registered to a man named Arthur Vance, but we believe the watcher was using it as a transient base." "And the grave?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan squeezed his decoy tight. "The forensics team excavated the area. We found what you described, a shallow, narrow trench. The topsoil was disturbed and hastily replaced." Chief Reynolds paused, visibly wrestling with the next words. "However, Mr. Miller, there were no human remains." Robert frowned, confusion replacing dread. "No remains?" But he dug it. He left the carving. "We found two things of note," the chief continued, leaning forward. "First, deeply embedded in the clay at the bottom of the trench, was a considerable length of heavy, rusted iron chain. It had clearly been cut with heavy-duty bolt cutters. And second, buried in the loose topsoil, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird figure. The number 11 was on its back." Robert and Ethan exchanged a knowing, horrified look. The watcher hadn't been digging a grave for a victim he had just taken. He had been performing a ritual, burying a piece of evidence, or perhaps marking the conclusion of a sequence. The chain matched the description of the small loop Ethan had seen by the fence. And the number 11 meant the grinning wooden face with the number 12 was the next step. What about Arthur Vance? The watcher. The person we believe is the watcher is gone. The van was empty, wiped clean. He clearly heard the sirens or saw our teams approaching. He's disappeared into the wider world, possibly miles away by now. Chief Reynolds confirmed, defeat evident in her posture. "But Mr. Miller, you saved your son's life. If you hadn't tracked him back to the clearing, if you hadn't found that grave marker, he may have come back for the 12th victim." Robert felt a wave of icy clarity. Ethan wasn't the 12th victim. Ethan was the target for the 12th position, the position the watcher had marked with the grinning figure. The decoy, the chasing, the fixation, it was all part of the ritual leading up to the final, fatal act. In the end, the watcher was never caught. The police released a national bulletin with the description of Arthur Vance. But the man had vanished without a trace, leaving only the chilling, documented evidence of his ritualistic behavior. The Miller family moved out of Blackwood Creek 2 weeks later. The charming, historic town felt too cold, too saturated with the fear they had experienced. They left the oak of the Skirse behind, leaving their own shadow buried beneath its sprawling branches. Months passed. The family was settling into a new home, miles away, in a bustling city where no one knew about ancient New England folklore or fresh graves in the dark woods. One evening, Ethan was unpacking the last of his boxes, the one labeled Halloween decorations. He found the small wooden decoy cross his father had made, nestled securely between 2 comic books. He picked it up, running his finger over the rough masking tape and the dull silver tracker still affixed to its center. He smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile of relief. But then his smile faltered. He noticed that the small, crudely carved wooden cross, The one his father had carefully created as a decoy was not entirely untouched. On the underside of the lowest horizontal arm, barely visible beneath a layer of protective tape, there was a minute, fresh carving, cut not with a knife, but perhaps with a sharp nail or a piece of glass. It was a single, tiny, jagged line, and next to it, even tinier, was the number 13. Ethan dropped the carving, his breath catching in his throat. He knew. The watcher hadn't just observed them. He had entered their home, retrieved the original decoy, and marked it. He had known the final truth about the scrawled figure all along. Ethan slowly walked to his bedroom window. The city lights were bright, the air thick with noise and life. It was nothing like the silent, foggy darkness of Blackwood Creek. Yet, as he looked down at the street, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Standing perfectly still, half hidden in the dense shadow of a street-side scaffolding, was a large, dark utilitarian work van. And in the window of a nearby apartment building, on the 4th floor, Ethan caught a fleeting reflection of a face. A man with pale eyes and a wide, impossible grin. The watcher hadn't been defeated. He had simply changed locations, and he was still keeping count. The story of Blackwood Creek was over, but the earth-worn shovel still had work to do. The end.